The first thing I noticed wasn't the shouting. It was the silence. An entire office floor, usually buzzing with phones, keyboards, and forced laughter, had gone completely still. People stood frozen beside their desks, half standing, half sitting, pretending not to stare while staring anyway. Two security guards walked down the center aisle, one on each side of him. My boss, the man who had fired me less than an hour ago. He was red in the face, tie loosened, eyes darting around like he was looking for someone to wake him up from a bad dream. "This is a misunderstanding," he snapped, pulling his arm back when one of the guards gestured toward the elevator. "I own this floor, you can't do this." No one answered him. I stood near the glass conference room, holding a slim folder against my chest, calm enough that even I was surprised. Inside, my heart was racing, but on the outside I looked exactly the way I always had: composed, professional, forgettable, just the secretary. An hour earlier, that same man had stood in his office doorway and told me to pack my things. "You think you're important," he'd said, voice loud enough for half the floor to hear. "Your support staff, replaceable, I don't need you." He'd enjoyed it. I could tell, he always did. Now he was the one being escorted out, his shoes scuffing against the carpet as the guards stopped at the elevator doors. Someone pressed the button. The soft ding sounded louder than any insult he'd ever thrown at me. He turned, finally noticing me. "You," he said sharply, pointing like he always did. "Fix this, call HR, call someone, do your job for once." I met his eyes and didn't move. For years I had done everything. Fixed his mistakes before anyone noticed. Calmed angry clients. Caught errors in contracts he never bothered to read. Stayed late, came in early, smiled through disrespect. And for years he never once asked how just a secretary lived the way I did. Never questioned why I wasn't desperate. Never wondered why I stayed calm when he tried to scare me. The elevator doors slid open. "Who authorized this?" he demanded, panic creeping into his voice now. "Who told security to remove me?" One of the guards finally answered. "The building owner." The words landed heavy. My boss laughed once, sharp, disbelieving. "That's impossible, I know the landlord." I took a step forward then, just one. "That's outdated information," I said quietly. He stared at me, confusion replacing his anger. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked unsure, small. The elevator doors began to close. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe my name, maybe an insult, but the doors sealed before the sound came out. The elevator descended. The floor exhaled. People slowly sat back down, whispers spreading like electricity. No one came up to me. No one asked questions. They just watched as I turned back toward my desk, placed the folder down neatly, and picked up my bag. Because this wasn't the beginning. This was the end. And the story of how a secretary ended up owning the building her boss thought he ruled started long before anyone realized I wasn't invisible at all. When I first started working there, no one noticed me, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I arrived early every morning before the office filled with noise and egos. I liked those quiet moments when the city was still stretching awake, when the glass walls reflected only my own silhouette and not the people who thought they owned everything inside them. I dressed professionally but simply. Nothing flashy. Nothing that invited questions. To them, I was just the secretary. I managed calendars that were always overbooked. I fixed meetings that were double scheduled. I caught mistakes in reports 5 minutes before they went to clients. When deals nearly collapsed, I was the one making discreet phone calls, smoothing things over, making sure my boss looked competent. He never thanked me. Instead, he barked orders from his office without looking up. Snapped his fingers when he wanted coffee. Corrected my tone in front of others as if I were a child. In meetings, he introduced me as support staff and made jokes about how secretaries were lucky to have jobs at all. People laughed. Not because it was funny, but because they were afraid. The office ran on fear, everyone knew it. HR knew it too, but HR answered to him and he answered to no one. Promotions went to people who stayed quiet. Raises went to people who agreed with him. Anyone who pushed back didn't last long. I watched all of it from my desk. What they didn't see was how much I noticed. Every contract that crossed my screen, every clause he skipped, every email he dictated without reading. I learned how the company actually worked, not the version he bragged about, but the fragile structure holding it together. Sometimes, coworkers would whisper to me by the printer. "How do you stay so calm?" they'd ask. "Doesn't he scare you?" I'd smile and shrug. "It's just a job." But that wasn't the whole truth. The truth was, I'd chosen that job for a reason. I'd already lived a different life before that office. One where I made decisions instead of following them. One where I signed documents with my name at the bottom, not typed someone else's. But I'd learned something early on: power attracts attention, and attention attracts problems, so I stepped back. I went quiet. I became invisible. My boss mistook my silence for weakness. He loved reminding me where he thought I belonged. When I once corrected a small error in a presentation, he smiled thinly and said, "Let the executives handle the thinking." When I suggested a scheduling change that saved a major client relationship, he took credit and later told me, "Don't get ideas above your station." Above your station. That phrase stayed with me. What stayed with me more was how careless he was. He assumed authority meant immunity, that no one beneath him could touch him. He left sensitive documents on my desk without a second thought. Trusted me with everything because he never believed I mattered enough to use it. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to see something he didn't. The company didn't own nearly as much as he claimed, especially not the ground beneath his feet. At the time, I didn't plan revenge. Not yet. I was still observing, still learning, still waiting. Because when you're underestimated, patience isn't a weakness, it's a weapon. The day everything changed didn't start dramatically. It started like any other workday: emails stacked, calendar packed, my boss already irritated before noon. I could tell by the way he slammed his office door and called my name without looking up, like summoning furniture instead of a person. "Big client meeting today," he said. "Don't mess it up." I nodded as always and went back to work. The client was important. Everyone knew it. A long-term contract, the kind that could make careers. I'd prepared for days, documents aligned, projections double-checked, contingencies ready. I even stayed late the night before to make sure nothing slipped through. The meeting started smoothly, too smoothly. Halfway through, one of the clients asked a question about a clause in the proposal. A small detail, but one that mattered. My boss hesitated, just for a second, long enough for me to recognize the look. He didn't know the answer. I quietly slid the annotated page toward him, just enough for him to see. He glanced down, then back up, and delivered the response flawlessly. The client nodded, impressed, and then my boss smiled. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this is why experience matters. You can't expect support staff to understand high-level decisions." The room laughed politely. I felt it then, not anger, not embarrassment, but clarity. After the meeting, he didn't even wait until we were alone. Standing in the hallway with people passing by, he turned to me and said, "Next time, don't interrupt. You're here to assist, not participate." "I didn't interrupt," I said calmly. "You asked for the document." His eyes narrowed. "Careful," he warned. "You're forgetting your place." That was the first time I looked directly at him and didn't look away. Later that afternoon, he called me into his office. Door open, audience present. He loved that. "I need you to redo the entire quarterly report by tomorrow morning," he said casually. "And fix the errors, the ones you missed." There were no errors, I knew that. "That's not possible by tomorrow," I replied. "Not accurately," he smiled, a slow, satisfied smile. "Then maybe this job isn't for you." That was it. No shouting. No dramatic outburst. Just a clear, deliberate reminder that he believed I was disposable, that everything I'd given meant nothing to him. I went back to my desk and worked anyway. All night, every number perfect, every chart clean. When I placed the finished report on his desk the next morning, he barely glanced at it. In the meeting later that day, he presented my work as his own. Then in front of the board, he said it. "She's good at typing," he laughed. "But strategy, that's above her level." I felt every eye flick toward me. Pity, curiosity, dismissal. I smiled. Inside, something locked into place. Fear left first. Then doubt. What remained was focus. Because in that moment, I realized something important. He didn't see me as a threat, and that meant he'd never see it coming. By the time I returned to my desk, I already knew I wasn't going to quit. I was going to wait. And when I moved, it would be final. After that meeting, I stopped reacting. No more tight smiles. No more silent swallowing of insults. Not because I was angry, but because I was done wasting energy on emotion. What I needed now was information. And fortunately for me, information had always flowed through my hands. I became quieter than ever. I listened when executives spoke too freely around me. I read every attachment instead of just forwarding it. I noticed which documents were marked urgent, which ones were ignored, and which ones my boss pretended to understand. That's when I started paying attention to the lease. It wasn't my responsibility, technically. But the document passed across my desk often enough: renewal notices, maintenance approvals, legal correspondence. My boss always waved it away. "Just file it," he'd say. "Facilities stuff, facilities stuff." One evening, long after everyone else had left, I opened the lease and read it properly. Not quickly, not casually. Line by line. The company didn't own the building. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual were the dates. the renewal window, the clauses my boss had ignored. Late payments, violations that could trigger termination if enforced by the landlord. I sat back in my chair and stared at the city lights outside the window. For years, my boss had acted like a king, untouchable, unmovable, but the foundation he stood on wasn't nearly as solid as he believed. The landlord was an investment group, aging partners, minimal involvement, everything handled through intermediaries. No emotional attachment, just numbers. Numbers I understood. I didn't rush. That was the most important part. People make mistakes when they move too fast, driven by anger or excitement. I wasn't driven by either. I was driven by certainty. I made quiet calls, not from my desk, not from my phone. I reached out to people I trusted, lawyers who didn't ask unnecessary questions, advisors who understood discretion. We spoke in hypotheticals. If a building like this were on the market, if a buyer wanted anonymity, if timing mattered more than price. Each answer sharpened the picture. At work, my boss grew worse. He sensed something, maybe not danger but resistance. He began criticizing me more openly, assigning tasks designed to humiliate rather than help. Once, he joked loudly about how secretaries should be grateful they weren't replaced by software. I laughed with everyone else. Inside, I checked another box. By the time the official notice came, quietly informing tenants that ownership discussions were underway, I was ready. I'd already run the numbers, already secured the structure, already decided. The offer went in through a holding company with a name no one recognized. Negotiations were brief. The sellers didn't care who I was, only that I could close. I could. While my boss ranted about expenses and delayed rent approvals, I signed documents he'd never see. While he yelled about authority, I became the authority. The day the deal closed, I didn't celebrate. I came into work early, as usual. Brewed coffee. Organized the calendar. Approved a maintenance request for the building's HVAC system. My building. He walked past my desk without looking at me. And that was when I realized how complete his blindness was, because he still thought he was standing on solid ground. And I was holding the deed beneath his feet. Owning the building didn't change how I walked into the office that morning. I still arrived early. Still wore the same neutral colors. Still sat at the same desk outside my boss's office. If anything, I became more invisible because power doesn't need to announce itself, it waits. The keys sat heavy in my bag, not the symbolic kind. Real ones, metal, cold, proof that everything beneath the polished floors and glass walls belonged to me now. Every office, every meeting room, every inch my boss paced while shouting orders. And he had no idea. The first time I approved a repair invoice as the new owner, I almost smiled. Almost. Instead, I filed it the same way I always had, routing it through the system he barely understood. He signed off without reading, annoyed at the interruption. "Why are building costs going up?" he snapped later. "Deferred maintenance," I replied calmly. "It was in the lease." He waved me off. "Whatever, just handle it." I did. Days passed, then weeks. The lease renewal deadline crept closer. Notices were sent. Emails flagged. All of them came to me first. All of them documented. I made sure everything was clean. Perfect. No missing signatures, no informal extensions, no favors. I wasn't building a trap, I was simply letting the rules work as written. My boss, meanwhile, grew more reckless. He missed meetings, blew up at staff, ignored warnings from legal. He assumed someone would clean up after him. They always had, until they didn't. The final incident came on a Tuesday. He stormed out of his office, red-faced, voice echoing across the floor. "Get in here," he barked. I followed him inside. The door stayed open. "You've been undermining me," he said. "Your attitude, your tone, you think you're smarter than me." "No," I said honestly. "I think I do my job," he laughed. "Your job exists because I allow it to." Then he fired me just like that, loud, public, satisfying for him. "Pack your things," he said. "Security will walk you out." I nodded, calm, polite, professional to the end. As I stood at my desk, coworkers stared in silence. Some looked angry, some looked afraid. A few looked hopeful, like maybe something had finally cracked. Security arrived. My boss watched with a smirk as they escorted me toward the elevator. He leaned against the doorway of his office, arms crossed, enjoying the performance. "Good luck out there," he called. "Secretaries are easy to replace." I turned back and met his eyes. "Is that what you think?" I asked. He frowned just for a second. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer, because the board meeting was already scheduled, and the lease violations were already documented, and the building owner had a seat at the table. As the elevator doors closed, I felt nothing but relief. Not because I was unemployed, but because he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. I didn't go home after they escorted me out. I went somewhere quieter. A small conference room in another building I owned, one he'd never stepped foot in, never yelled inside, never claimed as his kingdom. I sat at the table, placed my bag down, and opened the folder I'd been carrying for weeks. Inside were copies of everything he'd ignored: the lease clauses, the notices, the violations, the timeline. Facts don't raise their voices. They don't need to. My phone buzzed, then buzzed again. Texts from coworkers, missed calls from HR. Confused messages from people who had just realized something was wrong, but didn't yet know what. I ignored them all. The board meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. Official agenda: budget revisions, expansion planning, facilities update. My name was already on the attendee list, not as support staff, not as a note taker, as the building owner. When I arrived, I didn't sit at the back. I took the empty chair at the table, the one my boss always said was reserved. Few board members looked up surprised. One recognized me immediately. He began. I handed over my card. It had my name on it and my title. Silence spread slowly like a crack through glass. My boss walked in late as usual. He was still confident, still riding the high of firing me. He didn't look at me at first. He launched straight into his presentation, talking about growth, authority, control. Then he noticed the pause, the way the room had shifted, the way no one was smiling. He followed their gaze and saw me. "What is she doing here?" he snapped. "This is a closed meeting." "It is," the chairperson said evenly, "which is why she's here." I didn't speak yet. I let the discomfort do its work. Let him remember the last time he'd spoken to me, how sure he'd been of himself. Then I placed the folder on the table and slid it forward. "I'm here to discuss the building," I said. "Specifically your lease." He laughed. A short, sharp sound. "You don't have the authority." "I do," I replied. "As of last month." Someone cleared their throat. Another shifted in their seat. The chairperson nodded. "Ownership transferred. All documentation checks out." My boss's face drained of color. "No," he said, "that's impossible." "It's not," I said calmly. "You just didn't read." I walked them through it. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just facts, dates, missed payments, violations he'd dismissed. The termination clause he'd triggered himself over and over again. When I finished, the room was quiet. He looked around, searching for an ally. There were none. "You fired her," someone said finally, publicly. "Yes," he snapped. "Because she was support staff," I finished softly. "Replaceable," I stood. "As the building owner, and under the terms of the lease," I said, "I'm exercising my right to terminate tenancy effective immediately. And as a board member, I'm recommending your removal for gross misconduct." Security was already at the door. For the second time that day, he was escorted out. Only this time I didn't watch from the shadows. I watched from his seat. The office didn't erupt when he was taken away. It went quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Lighter. Like a storm had finally passed, and everyone was waiting to see what the sky would look like afterward. The board adjourned quickly. There was nothing left to debate. Decisions that had been stalled for years were suddenly easy to make once the loudest voice in the room was gone. Paperwork was signed. Interim leadership was appointed. A formal investigation was announced. I stayed seated until the room emptied. For a moment, I just looked at the chair he'd occupied for so long. The one he'd leaned back in, confident, dismissive, untouchable. It was strange how ordinary it looked now. Just another chair. Just another place someone sat and thought they were permanent. When I stepped back onto the office floor, people didn't pretend not to see me anymore. They stood. Slowly, one by one, no applause, no dramatic gestures, just quiet recognition, relief, respect. A woman from accounting approached first. Her hands were shaking slightly. I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for doing what none of us could." I nodded. "You shouldn't have had to." Others followed. Short conversations. Small smiles. Stories whispered about things they'd endured, comments, threats, fear of losing jobs they depended on. I listened more than I spoke. Power, I'd learned, wasn't about being heard. It was about hearing what everyone else had been forced to swallow. That afternoon, I walked through the building alone. Past offices that had once felt hostile. Past conference rooms where I'd been told to sit quietly and take notes. Past the desk where I'd answered phones and absorbed insults like they were part of the job. None of it felt small anymore, because it was. The next few weeks moved quickly. Lawyers handled what needed handling. HR suddenly found its spine. Policies were rewritten. Managers were replaced. The culture didn't change overnight, but it started to breathe. As for him, the fallout was immediate. Word travels fast in corporate circles. Faster when it's true, faster still when it's documented. He went from powerful executive to legal liability almost overnight. Interviews were canceled. Calls stopped being returned. The same confidence he'd once worn like armor became a liability no one wanted near them. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. One evening, long after the office had emptied, I stood by the window and looked out over the city lights. The same view I'd had as a secretary. The same skyline. The same streets. What had changed was never the view. It was where I was standing. I thought about the version of me who had sat at that desk, quiet and observant, treated like furniture. About how close I'd come to believing the limits someone else had assigned me. Power doesn't always look like authority. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like someone letting you underestimate them until it's too late. I picked up my bag and turned off the lights. Tomorrow, there would be work to do. Real work. That mattered. But tonight, I allowed myself one small smile, because the man who thought he owned me had learned the truth. He never did. The building felt different after that, not quieter, just calmer. Like everyone had been holding their breath for years and didn't realize it until they finally exhaled. Mornings were no longer filled with dread. Meetings no longer felt like battlegrounds. People spoke without flinching. I didn't announce changes with speeches or grand gestures. I listened first. I met with teams in small groups, asked simple questions. What's broken? What works? What would you fix if you weren't afraid? At first, they answered carefully like they were waiting for a trick. Then slowly the truth came out. Unrealistic deadlines, credit stolen, fear disguised as high standards. We fixed what we could. We owned what we couldn't yet. Leadership shifted, not all at once but deliberately. People who had thrived on intimidation found themselves uncomfortable in a place that no longer rewarded it. Some left on their own. Others learned, adapted, and stayed. Accountability became normal instead of threatening. No one called me just a secretary again. Outside the company, the story spread. Quietly at first, then louder. It always does. The version people repeated was simpler than the truth, cleaner, easier to digest. A revenge story, a power move, a cautionary tale. I let them tell it however they needed to. As for him, I heard updates without asking. A canceled consulting gig, a lawsuit quietly settled, a resume that stopped opening doors the way it used to. Power built on fear doesn't age well once the fear is gone. One afternoon, I found myself standing by the same desk where I'd once answered phones and scheduled meetings for a man who thought that made him important. The desk was empty now, waiting for someone new. I ran my hand over the surface and smiled, not out of bitterness but gratitude. That desk taught me patience, observation, timing. It taught me that people reveal everything when they think you don't matter. If there was a lesson in all of it, it wasn't about revenge. It was about misjudgment. About how often confidence is confused with competence. About how dangerous it is to believe titles define worth. I never corrected anyone who assumed I'd risen from nothing. I never explained that I'd chosen silence long before I chose action. Some truths don't need defending. On my way out that evening, the security guard at the front desk nodded at me with a smile. "Good night," he said. "See you tomorrow, tomorrow." A word that used to feel heavy now felt open. I stepped outside, the city humming around me, and thought about how close I'd come to walking away once. How easy it would have been to accept someone else's version of my place in the world. I didn't. And because of that, everything changed. Not because I raised my voice, not because I demanded respect, but because I waited. And when the moment came, I owned it.